My talk's going to focus on the millennials in the United States, but I wanted to mention that my work is as a global and digital sociologist. So I got looking at internet and online love and how people are meeting and how computing was changing society quite some time ago. So I've been watching the development of this over time. So I've been developing a theoretical framework which I'm going to introduce to you today, and I'm working on a book on this topic. So we're just going to have sort of an appetizer version of this, but I want to let you know what we'll be looking at. It'll be a little bit broader than just the relationship aspects. So kind of let's get into this. On the way here, we're talking about societies and how they're getting so digitally immersed now. I had an Uber driver pick me up in California in the Los Angeles area, and he was talking about how he had people coming in from Brazil. He didn't speak their language, they didn't speak English, and he used Google Translate in order to take them on a tour of Hollywood and whatnot and speak with them, and how great that was. And he was saying how it's bringing our worlds closer together. I then arrived at the airport, and it took some time to get some of my information into the computing system, and 3 ladies were working diligently, and it was a little bit frustrating, but they were very persistent. At the end, I said, hey, great job. Thanks for being so patient with this and really working it out. And the lady looked at me, and instead of just saying thank you, which I was expecting, she goes, hey, you've got to tweet that. And I went, oh my gosh, so, what a change. Like, instead of just saying, hey, thanks, for the compliment, I now have to put it online. So it just showed me that things are changing, and because of digital connectivity, because of mobile and social, which we'll look at in more detail, values, behaviors, and expectations, both in terms of consumers and the workforce, are changing. So I want to look at that in a little bit more detail. Have you guys seen this? Picture people walking along with their heads down looking at their mobile phones. I've seen this everywhere. I travel a lot. People almost run into you. Have you ever had that happen in an airport or public space? And then, they look up sort of shocked that there's another human being around them. So this idea got me thinking about how, especially younger folks are sort of disconnecting from the environment in which they find themselves in. And no matter where you go, you're going to see images like this, and you can imagine in your life some of these. A friend of mine, actually one of the developers of the iPhone, he now says, what have I done, This is his family picture. He posted this up with, no irony or anything. Oh, here's the family at dinner. And there they were. And I thought, doesn't anybody see anything wrong with this picture? Nobody's interacting. Everybody's on their own screen. This is an example of a family dinner in the United States. Participating in events is changing. You can see it over time. Here's 2005. This happens to be in Rome, but you could see this anywhere. And 2013, all the screens are up. They're filming, they're photographing, and a very clear difference just in the last few years. Going to a concert often means you've got that screen up. You can see a sea of screens. Have you ever seen that? At a concert now. Some artists are now saying, hey, no cell phones, no filming, but this is very typical of young folks going to a show now, this idea. And even what it means to be out in nature is being disconnected because of these digital technologies. People are laughing at this guy, this whale's going by, he doesn't even see it because he's there texting his friends. So this idea that this ubiquitous digital connectivity is going on, facilitated by mobile devices, is really changing our whole society and changing expectations. Last summer, Facebook went down in the United States, and in Los Angeles, so many people called the sheriff's department to report that Facebook was down, that they took to Twitter and say, hey, stop calling us. We don't know when Facebook's going to come up. This is not a law enforcement issue. A recent study shows just how important this digital connectivity has become for millennials. This was a study done of college age and young in the workforce groups by Cisco. 2/3 of millennials would choose the internet over a car. And 1/3 said that internet connectivity is as important as food, water, or air. And a half said it's close to that important. So, the internet and air, think about it, So this idea that it's just critical to have this connectivity. I was with David Horsey in Idaho last week at a tech conference called DENT, and he came up with this drawing, here we are evolving along, and now we're evolving looking at these screens, the next generation. So, it just got me thinking about how disconnected many younger people are becoming from things, from their environments, from things that are going on around them, and that there's always this screen, this digital mediator between physical experiences and what's going on for millennials. So I thought this really captured it. So let's take a look more closely at this analytical framework I'm talking about becoming untethered, or how people are disconnecting from the world around them. And there's been a set of intersecting trends, megatrends, if you will, in the United States, and I would suggest that many of these are going on globally as well. Economic, social, technical changes that are intersecting in the United States in particular, and more globally in more general sense, which is emanating new values, new behaviors, and new expectations. So let's take a look at this context for a minute. I created this diagram for you to kind of think about it. The top and bottom, to me, are the mega context issues. The first is the digital era, the emergence of everyday people using the internet, is what we're talking about. And the bottom is, in the United States, our economic backdrop. Now, within that, you can see going left to right, the social, and I'm talking here about social media. Second, the idea of the mobile revolution, the idea that now we're moving away from desktop connectivity and we're moving towards mobile connectivity of the internet, of social media, of communication. Thirdly, this idea that generational values are changing that you all had mentioned earlier today, and I would suggest that this is linked to the first two, leading to behavioral change, expectation change, and things. And what I'm going to say is that these things can be summed up in this idea called an untethered society, and we'll look more specifically at that in just a moment. But the key points about the context first. One is that this economic backdrop happened during key formative times for millennials, when they're children, when they're teens, leaving an indelible impression similar to the Depression era folks in the United States. In fact, the economic downturn is the worst since the Depression era, so it made a big impact. And thirdly, also mentioned earlier, was this idea that 9/11 and similar events that you could think of, our bank collapse, that we had real estate collapse, a lot of parents of this group lost their jobs, lost their savings, lost their homes. The idea that there's this lack of faith in traditional processes, institutions, and all because of these factors, which you could summarize as called a risk society. The second idea of mega context is the digital context. 2 points here. One, that the pace of change is faster than any time in human history. If you think about other technological innovations like the automobile, like the television, the pace of time it took for more of the mainstream to adopt it is much faster. And second, that no one controls the internet. It's become a disruptive force where the average person can be a broadcaster, if you will. It can be very disruptive to traditional structures. You talked about shopping as one of these, for example. In the US, why do we want to look at millennials? Well, it's the largest generation in US history, bigger than the baby boomers, and they're set to dominate the workforce and the consumer groups by this year. So I think that's really key, and we've looked at some of the breakdown here before. A few key points here. One, that social mobile, as I mentioned before, is taking over desktop connectivity of the internet, and we can take a look at a image here on that from Morgan Stanley. So the idea that we're connecting to each other and to shopping, to all these activities, to social via mobile phones and things. And second, that users are moving from browsing on desktops, on web browsers, towards more apps, towards more social media and things of that nature. And you can see that this is very age-defined. At the top, the dark is the younger users, the millennials, and then straight on down, the less likely to use are the older folks. So definitely these trends are hitting the younger folks. They grew up with them, and I think that we're seeing a large set of changes coming about as a result of the intersection of these megatrends. And here's the definition I want to give to you of what I'm calling an untethered society. It's a condition where ties to people, places, jobs, traditional institutions, and organizing structures are weakened or broken and are displaced by digital hyperconnectivity. So that's really the analytical framework for all these ideas. Now, I'm going to give you just a few examples. Again, this is just a taste of these things that I'm working on. But originally, when you think about being tethered, we want to think about sort of the golden age of the family, which is the post-World War II. Everybody came back and wanted to have a part of this American dream. The American dream is typically thought of as something like this: a little house, white picket fence, 2.5 kids, a car, a dog, and you've made it. You're married with your children in your house. That was the definition of success in this time. And now, because of some of these changes that I'm mentioning, things are starting to change. Millennials are unhooking from this American dream. And you can see here, just as an example, the percentage of being married between age 18 and 32 by generation. So if you go back to the silent generation, pre-baby boomers, 65% of them had achieved marriage by the time they were about early 30s. Now it's only 26% of millennials. Huge change, and you can see it stacking right down the way. Now, I wanted to bring this to you, the idea of adulthood. Now, we're talking about becoming an adult and achieving the milestone of marriage. Well, that's one of 5 that researchers identify as achieving adulthood: completing school, leaving home, becoming financially independent, marrying, and having a child. These are the 5. And if you look at it now, by 1960, by age 30, 77% of women and 65% of men had achieved all 5 milestones. But by 2000, less than a third of women and less than half the women and a third of the men had achieved those milestones. So something is clearly shifting in terms of buying into this American dream, in terms of achieving this American dream. Things are happening here. Here's another big one. 57% now of children born in the US are born out of wedlock. In other words, outside of a marriage context. 57%. That's the majority now. So something is clearly changing here in terms of values and behaviors. Why is this important? We looked at this before because this is a huge generation, bigger than the boomers, coming down the pipeline. And their preferences, their values, their behaviors are going to impact both consumption patterns, workplace patterns, and other things, which I'll get at a little bit later. So these adults are coming from somewhere. Where are they coming from? Well, obviously they grew up with this digital environment, and I think this is really important. The idea that this is the first generation where there always was an internet when they're young and when they're teenagers and things. Take a look at an average 30-year-old life so far, you can see the internet becomes a thing in middle school. If you look at a typical 18-year-old's life, now the younger ends of this, you'll see the internet always was a thing. So I think that's really important, to grow up in a digitally immersed society. It's the first generation to do so. It's making a difference. Now, kids are taking that as a part of their identity. They're growing up, they're socializing patterns. Kids now, 8 to 18 years old, are spending 7.5 hours a day online, usually on a mobile device. 7.5 hours a day. Who's teaching the kids? They're only spending about 6 hours in school. So this idea that being online, connecting online is important. It's important to identity develop for these young becoming adults. There's this saying, photo or it didn't happen, pic or it didn't happen. So the idea that people are taking selfies everywhere, whether or not it's appropriate to gain likes, to gain attention. Recently on the internet, this photograph went around of a girl who took this smiling selfie at Auschwitz, caused a huge uproar. But this is very typical. Last week we had a big explosion in New York City. I don't know if the news got over here, but it was in the East Village. And a group got together with a selfie stick so they could get a big group in and took a picture in front of this explosion where people died. And so the New York Post put it on there, the Village Idiots, because it was in the East Village. But, but here it is, very typical, whether it's a disaster where, so the more shocking in a way, the more likely you are to get attention, the more likely you are to garner likes. It's a new value system, and it's a new currency, this idea of liking things and sharing things. Connectivity has become so important that parents are now taking away Facebook and social media as punishment. It's seen as so severe that they've actually had suicides as a result. A teen girl commits suicide because her parents banned her from Facebook. We've also seen young kids murdering their parents over the same issue. These values and behaviors, again, will translate into the workforce, of course. As millennials get into school, they want to bring your own device to work policy. And they're even questioning why be in an office at all. So 7 out of 10 of them are saying, it's not even necessary. Why don't I go work at the Starbucks on my laptop? I don't need to be in an office. Why is this important? Because older generations are going, yeah, why do I need to be in an office? So it's actually spilling out into other generations and their ideas about what it means to be at work. 2/3 of students now will ask about social media policies when they're interviewed for a job. 56% will not accept a job that bans social media, and 1/3 prioritize bringing your own device to work policies over salary. It just shows how important and how embedded and ingrained this idea of being hyper-connected digitally is. So let's wrap up on a few sort of overview points here. One is that talking about this idea before about consumption, that mobile is king. These kids want instant, on-demand, be it shopping, be it conversations, be it work, whatever it might be. The idea that there's a preference for a digital sort of a mediator between experiences. You know, you're at an airport, you can easily flag down a taxi. In the United States, a lot of the kids will use Uber instead to get that taxi. They want that digital mediation point. They're not calling people, they're not emailing, they want to text them. These values are changing. The idea of a real or authentic story, if you will, when you're presenting things. The idea that it's a customizable, all about me world. On demand, we talked about a moment ago, but this idea of one-click ordering. I click something and food arrives. I click something and a driver arrives. I click something, alcohol arrives. I click something, a dog walker shows up and walks my dog. So there's more and more businesses that are buying into this one-click on-demand society. And there's this movement, as I said, they're untethering from home ownership, untethering from families. So there's a movement toward the sharing economy. Why buy a house when I can borrow someone else's? Why buy a car when I can use someone else's? So this digital connectivity is facilitating this whole new culture of sharing, culture of borrowing, this kind of new sharing economy. A couple other things we talked about, but I just want to give a dark side to it, and that's the idea that with this disconnection comes a price. We're seeing in the college atmosphere a higher than ever percentage of students coming in with mental issues, depression, anxiety, and things of that nature. Long-standing social studies, I won't go into them right now, but have shown that connectivity to churches, to marriages, to families, to neighborhoods actually helps with mental health. So this idea when you have disconnection, that there's also a price to be paid for that, and we're seeing it already. And lastly, with this disconnection, this more simulated physical environment, simulated activities, gaming, there's a human desire built over generations of, thousands of years, millions of years of development of physicality, of making things, of building things. That's how we developed our physicality, our brains. So there's counter movements now to address that need. The slow movement, slow foods as opposed to fast foods. Back to nature, things like urban beekeeping, gardening at your house are starting to take off. And this idea of going back to the farm, there's magazines called The New Frontier. And if you look at them, I was looking through one of the first things, how do we do this on the frontier, was addressing how to have internet connectivity on your farm. So they still want that. And the makers movement, making things with your hands. So I think you're going to see more of these sort of counter movements coming out. So again, this is just a taste of some of this framework that I'm developing. This book is going to be called The Untethered Society, where I'm looking at a number of sectors where this is playing out, including with the brain, with children, with adults, and what some of the implications are for society. I'm happy to be here with you today. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.